People often ask me the same question. Can Russia ever change? Can it ever become a normal country? Reforms don't appear out of thin air. They need a foundation, a shared idea of what's right, what's wrong, and what the future should look like. And here's where the problem begins. For centuries, Russia has defined itself not by what it is, but by what it is not. Not Europe, not the West. A proud rival that secretly depends on its decadent neighbor for everything, from machine tools to markets. After the French Revolution, Russian elites looked across Europe and saw nightmare. Kings beheaded, nobles bankrupt, new men rising from nowhere, bankers, engineers, industrialists. And they thought, if that's the progress, we want none of it. That's how the myth was born, the myth of the Decadent West. A dangerous, godless place where order collapses and moral boundaries dissolve. A myth that still shapes how millions of Russians see the world today. I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union. In this video, we'll step inside that crooked mirror and see what Russians really mean when they talk about the Decadent West. Here's our roadmap for tonight. The crooked mirror, how Russia projects its own flaws onto the West. The architecture of the myth, the stereotypes that define decadence, moral inversion, why believing in Western immorality justifies Russian amorality, the longevity of the lie, how a myth that fails again and again still refuses to die. And along the way, I'll share real conversations with people who sincerely believe the West is collapsing, even as they are watching it on the newest iPhones. Before we begin, if independent, fearless analysis matters to you, please take a second to share this video, like, and subscribe. You can also join my think tank, buy me a coffee, or support through PayPal or Super Thanks. Every contribution helps this channel stay free, independent, and answer to no one. And if you'd like to follow my upcoming novel, The Snow Queen Spring, where I explore how Russians see the West through this same distorted lens, you can subscribe to my newsletter using the link in the description. That's where I share early chapters, research notes, and the discoveries I can't yet share here. Now, let's step into the crooked mirror. The crooked mirror. To understand how Russia sees the West, you have to understand one thing. What Russians are actually seeing is not the West at all. They are looking into a mirror, a crooked one. They know very little about what's truly happening in the West. Language barriers make it hard to access real information, and many don't even know where to look in the first place. Add to this a deeper problem, the collapse of the humanities. During the Soviet era, literature, history, and philosophy were replaced with propaganda. In the 2000s, there was a brief revival, but when Putin launched the war in Ukraine, the remaining scientists, teachers, and public intellectuals were either silenced or forced abroad. The space for free thought vanished. So, what's left? A patchwork of superstition, half-remembered history, fragments of state media, and the words of a few experts who seem articulate enough to sound convincing. If a pundit looks educated, speaks with confidence, and offers an explanation that feels comforting, he becomes an authority. For many, credibility doesn't depend on knowledge. It depends on how well a person can confirm what you already believe. And that's how a very strange phenomenon is born. Every Russian theory about the West is actually a reflection of Russia itself, its own fears and its own contradictions, projected outward. I have a friend in Russia. Let's call him Max. He is intelligent, curious, and politically aware. He even watches banned YouTube channels through VPN and prides himself on being well informed. And yet, his worldview is peculiar, to say the least. We often argue. Recently, I asked him a simple question. What's the personal benefit for you in living under an authoritarian regime? Why wouldn't you want Russia to live like Poland? Not attacking anyone, having fair elections, building its own culture, tourism, education, and industry. His answer stunned me. He said, Russia could never live like Poland because that would mean lying under the West. And Russia, he said, will never do that. When I asked what exactly lying under the West meant, he turned to philosophy. The difference, he explained, is in how we understand humanity. The Western worldview was formed by Kipling, the burden of the white man. The West sees itself as a teacher of nations, bringing civilization to others who are half children, half savages. They think they have a sacred right to instruct the world. That's why they hate China, because China dares to claim leadership without being white. Russia, he continued, is different. It's a civilization built on compassion, the responsiveness of the Russian soul. We see all people as equals. We have no double standards. If the West can take Kosovo, why can't Russia take Crimea? For us, it's about fairness. And the West can stand that because Russians are white too. But we don't share their Kipling complex. I don't believe what I was hearing. Because in reality, Russia has spent centuries conquering its neighbors and forcibly educating them, calling it bringing civilization. It's an official imperial doctrine. We came to the wild peoples of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and others, built schools and railways, taught them to read and write. So where is their gratitude? We'll hear the same tone when Russians speak about Eastern Europe. We helped them rebuild after the war. So what if we crashed 3 generations along the way? We lived in peace. How does this square with invading Ukraine? A country Russia still denies the right to its own policy or identity. Where exactly is the equality and compassion in that? The belief that Russia has no imperialism is so absurd, it leaves you speechless. And the idea that Russia has no double standards, that it treats everyone equally, is simply false. Official media openly promotes nationalism. Children are taught to see the world through the lens of hierarchy and pride. And the most painful domestic topic in Russia right now? Migrant workers from Central Asia. The economy depends on them. Yet they are treated with contempt. They are underpaid, humiliated, and subjected to constant racism. It's an open wound and everyone knows it. So how can Max not see this? He does see it. It bothers him. He just doesn't want to think that it's his problem or his country's. It's easier to believe that all of this ugliness lives somewhere else. And so he projects it outward onto the West. In Max's mind, the West is rotten and doomed, a civilization collapsing under its own sins. He's certain that Russia will win the war in Ukraine and that this victory will finally prove the superiority of the Russian world, spiritual, disciplined, uncorrupted by Western decadence. This belief gives him comfort. It transforms fear into destiny and national decline into moral triumph. It tells him, we may be poor, but we are purer. We suffer, but we are chosen. And he's not alone. Millions think exactly the same way. In the next chapter, we'll look closely at what Max and so many like him really believe about the West. And we'll see again and again that each accusation they make is just another reflection in that crooked mirror. The architecture of the myth. The myth of the Decadent West is built like a fortress. It has several layers, each protecting the next. On the surface, there are the familiar stereotypes: moral decay, hypocrisy, weakness, greed, and spiritual emptiness. Beneath them lies a conviction that Russia is the only civilization still guided by truth, while the West has long since sold its soul. The first wall of this fortress is the accusation of moral decay. According to this logic, Western societies have lost their faith, replaced God with money, and dismantled the family. Feminism, LGBTQ plus rights, and tolerance are not seen as expression of freedom or equality, but as symptoms of terminal sickness. The irony, of course, is that the same people who accuse the West of moral collapse live in a society where lying has become a survival skill, corruption is normalized, and violence is romanticized as patriotism. The moral decay they describe is their own, only projected outward, so it hurts less to look at. Yes, of course. The Russian elites are true bastion of morality. Almost every man at the top keeps several lovers, sometimes even of the same sex. In their circles, having a young, beautiful body by your side is just another status symbol, no different from a new car or an expensive watch. The second wall is the claim of Western hypocrisy. The West preaches democracy but invades other countries, they say. The United States attacked Iraq. NATO bombed Yugoslavia, so what gives them the right to criticize us? It is a comforting argument because it levels the playing field. If everyone is guilty, then no one is responsible. The logic of whataboutism serves as both shield and aesthetic. You can excuse any crime if you find someone else who once committed something similar. But in these debates, one thing is always ignored: the circumstances. When NATO bombed Yugoslavia, it was not to seize territory or install a puppet government. The goal was to stop ethnic cleansing and mass killings. To compare that to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, aimed at conquering and reintegrating a neighboring country, is to erase every fact that matters. The same distortion applies to Iraq. Yes, the United States invasion was a mistake, a brutal and costly one. But Iraq was not a peaceful country minding its own business. For years, Saddam Hussein's regime had threatened oil routes to Europe, destabilizing the region, and defied international inspections on weapons programs. Washington chose a bad solution to a real problem. But the result was not plunder. It's enough to look at the numbers. The Iraq War cost the United States over $2 trillion, according to the Congressional Budget Office, more than $2.2 trillion by 2023, and over 4,500 American lives. No gold, no oil, no profit came back. It was an error, not a haste. Yet in Russian conversations, none of this context exists. The narrative is clean, simple, and flattering. They invaded, so we can invade. Complexity disappears. Nuance becomes weakness. And in this flattering of moral reality, the Russian mind finds peace, because it's always easier to repeat they are just as bad than to admit we've become worse. Marx and those who think like him extend the same logic to freedom of speech. They insist that censorship exists everywhere, that the Kremlin's control of the media is no different from the West banning Russia Today broadcasts. It sounds persuasive until you look closer. In Russia, censorship is the default setting. Television, newspapers, and online platforms operate under direct state supervision. and dissent can cost you your job, your freedom, or your life. In the West, bans like the one on Russia today are specific and limited. Responses to state propaganda funded by foreign governments during wartime. Russia today was not silenced for its opinions, but for acting as a mouthpiece of an aggressor state, spreading disinformation while its army was killing civilians. The difference is simple. In Russia, censorship protects power from truth. In the West, restrictions defend truth from weaponized power. That distinction may seem subtle to people like Max, but it's crucial. One system silences the weak, the other limits the strong. Then comes the accusation of weakness. In this narrative, Western people are spoiled and lazy, incapable of sacrifice, obsessed with comfort and pleasure. Men are feminized, women are domineering, and young people are addicted to their phones. Western civilization, they say, is collapsing under its own softness. This is an especially revealing projection because Russian life in reality demands passivity. The system rewards obedience, not initiative. Criticism can ruin your career or worse your life. And so the myth of Western weakness functions as a psychological mirror. It is not the West that has become soft. It is the Russian individual, exhausted by fear and unable to act. Another layer is the belief in spiritual superiority. We are poor but soulful, the saying goes. Russians see themselves as more sincere, more compassionate, more capable of suffering nobly. Westerners, by contrast, are accused of being cold, mechanical, and shallow. But this supposed depth of the Russian soul is often just a poetic name for trauma, a collective defense mechanism built on endurance rather than freedom. When survival becomes a virtue, suffering begins to look like meaning. The next wall is conspiracy. The West, in this view, is not a collection of nations with different interests, but a single dark organism ruled by hidden elites. Globalists, bankers, Freemasons, choose your villain. In this vision, the world is controlled by an invisible hand, manipulating wars, revolutions, and pandemics. It's comforting because it offers simplicity. If everything is controlled by someone, then chaos is an illusion, and you are not powerless, just outplayed. This belief is deeply rooted in Orthodox fatalism and Soviet propaganda alike. The idea that human will means nothing compared to vast hidden forces. And then there's the familiar anti-Americanism. The idea that the United States is the source of all global evil. Every war, every political crisis, every new cultural trend is supposedly Washington's doing. America, in this mythology, is not a real country, but a metaphor for corruption, arrogance, and control. To hate America is to cleanse yourself from the shame of dependence on its technology, its culture, and its wealth. All of these beliefs form one cohesive architecture, a mental fortress designed to protect a fragile identity. The myth shields people from doubt, from guilt, from the unbearable thought that maybe the problem is not out there, but at home. Every accusation against the West is a way to avoid the mirror. This is why the myth survives every failure. When the country collapses, it is the West's fault. When soldiers die, it is the West's conspiracy. When young people protest, they are Western agents. The pattern never breaks because the mirror never changes. And in the center of this fortress stands a single comforting belief. The West is doomed, and Russia is destined to inherit its place. For Max and millions like him, this is not politics. It is prophecy. The war in Ukraine, in their eyes, is not aggression, but purification. a final test of moral strength. Victory will prove that Russia's suffering was not in vain, that decay is happening elsewhere, not within. Moral inversion. Every myth needs a moral key. For Russia, that key is the conviction that the West has no morality at all. It is repeated everywhere, from television studios to Telegram channels. They are hypocrites. They talk about human rights, but they kill, lie, and exploit. We are no worse than they are. This belief didn't appear out of nowhere. It was inherited from the Soviet worldview, where capitalism was described as greedy and self-destructive. Lenin's famous phrase, "The capitalists will sell us the rope with which we'll hang them," still lives in collective memory. It justifies the idea that Western societies are morally bankrupt and driven only by profit. If that's true, then Russia's own cynicism and brutality are not crimes. They are realism. Even many educated Russians think this way. They see Western morality as theater, a show for voters, a tool of manipulation. In this logic, morality equals weakness, and sincerity is for fools. Power, not ethic, defines truth. Being right doesn't win wars, Max once told me. Being strong does. That's the essence of moral inversion. The West is accused of pretending to be moral, while Russia is praised for being honestly immoral. The very act of admitting corruption becomes proof of authenticity. We don't hide it, they say. At least we are honest about who we are. But the reality is the opposite. In the West, morality, messy, contradictory, and sometimes performative, still functions as a mechanism of accountability. Public figures can be fired, elections can be lost, careers can collapse because of moral scandal. The fact that society debates right and wrong so loudly is proof that moral standards exist and still matter. In Russia, morality ends where power begins. The state demands loyalty, not conscience. Lying on behalf of the regime is not shameful, it's patriotic. Cruelty toward the weak is excused as defense of tradition, and anyone who questions this is labeled a traitor. The myth of Western immorality is convenient because it removes responsibility. If everyone is corrupt, then no one has to change. If the whole world lies, then truth becomes irrelevant. This is why the myth survives. It protects people not from the West, but from guilt. It allows those who support the regime to believe that moral rules are for others, gullible losers, not for them. That's why moral inversion is not just an intellectual error. It is the psychological core of Russian authoritarianism. When evil is rebranded as strength, repentance becomes impossible. And a nation that can't feel guilt can only repeat its crimes. The longevity of the lie. The myth of the Decadent West has been disproven countless times, yet it survives. Empires have fallen, borders have changed, generations have come and gone, but the idea that the West is rotten and Russia is righteous remains intact. It mutates, it adapts, it dresses itself in new words, but the structure is always the same. The question is, why? The answer is simple. Because it serves a purpose. The myth gives millions of people emotional shelter. It replaces unbearable uncertainty with moral clarity. If the West is corrupt, then Russia's poverty and isolation are not failures. They are proof of virtue. If democracy everywhere is fake, then there's no shame in living under dictatorship. The myth protects pride. It makes powerless victims feel superior to those who are free. It also helps the elites. For rulers who can offer neither prosperity nor justice, ideology becomes a substitute for both. They need a story that explains why life is hard and why it's not their fault. So the same narrative is repeated in every form. The world conspires against us, foreign agents poison our youth, and reform equals collapse. Propaganda reinforces this belief until it becomes instinct. The repetition works like hypnosis. Every talk show, every headline, every sermon tells people that the West hates them, fears them, and is them. After years of hearing it, most stop questioning it. They don't need to believe every word. They just absorb the rhythm. It becomes the emotional background of life, the pulse of belonging. What also keeps the myth alive is fear. Change in Russia has rarely come peacefully. Every attempt to reform ended in chaos, repression, or war. The memory of collapse makes people cling to the stability at any cost. And if that stability demands illusions, they accept them. Better a familiar lie than another catastrophe. Then there's habit, the most reliable cement of all. For generations, Russians have been taught to distrust outsiders and to endure quietly. The myth of the hostile world fits perfectly into that psychology. It explains everything and demands nothing. You don't have to act, to think, to take risks. You just have to wait until the storm passes, certain that everyone else will sink first. But myths that promise safety always end up destroying it. The lie about the Decadent West blinds Russia to its own decay. It freezes the country in moral adolescence, forever comparing itself to imaginary enemies instead of confronting its real problems. And the longer this lie lasts, the higher the price of waking up from it will be. The tragedy is that many people like Max are not evil. They are simply confused and desperate for dignity, for some higher meaning in what is happening to their country. So let me ask you, especially those watching from Russia or with family there, what is the one lie you were taught about the Decadent West that once you tested it in real life simply fell apart? Tell me in the comments. Your answers become the map for others finding their way out. If this video challenged you or gave language to something you've felt, please share it, like and subscribe. If you want this work to stay independent, you can join my think tank, buy me a coffee, support via PayPal, or send a super thanks. Every bit helps this channel answer to truth, not to patrons of power. Thank you for watching and for refusing the lie that excuses everything. See you in the next video.